Dark side, light this bitch up.
What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. Okay, today is a pretty unique interview for me. I first started speaking with a lawyer by the name of Alka Pradhan about 2 months ago regarding the human rights cases that her and her firm were involved with, specifically pertaining to prisoners inside GITMO, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And through a subsequent acquaintanceship that I've had with Alka, we were able to secure our guest today. Our guest today is the lawyer who represents this man. His name is Amar Albelucci, and he has been in GITMO since 2006. If you've ever seen the movie Zero Dark 30, you may have remembered that there was a prisoner inside that movie for the first half hour or something of the film. And it almost seemed like he was like a crash test dummy for CIA agents to practice what they would call enhanced interrogation techniques, what most people would call torture. And the producers of the film even admitted that it was based off of Ammar, and also that the CIA actually gave more information to the producers of that film than they did to Ammar's actual attorneys. So we today are going to speak with one of those attorneys, and his name is James Connell. James, welcome to Blackballed, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
So you are right now are you in Delta Camp right now? Where are you right now?
No, I'm in what's called a containerized housing unit, which is a um, uh, military housing that they put us in down here at Guantanamo. This is, to be honest, the nicest we've ever had. We've stayed in all kinds of stuff from tiny little rooms to regular hotels, and this containerized housing unit is the nicest place I've ever stayed on Guantanamo. I can promise you the prisoners don't have it as good.
No, they don't. And that's one of the main reasons why you're here. Can you give me first a sort of intro on how the case came to you and what you thought of it when you first started reading about Ammar's case?
So I first got involved in Amar's case back in 2008. And I was a death penalty lawyer at the time, working mostly in Virginia, but also in Texas and DC to some extent. And I had a co-counsel who was an Army reservist who got called up to um, the office that defends people at Guantanamo Bay. And Amar's case was a death penalty case. They knew they needed a death penalty lawyer. They reached out to me, and I wasn't the lead lawyer on the case at the time at all. But I did a lot of work on the case. And then when the Obama administration came in January of 2009, they essentially dropped the cases, the military commission death penalty cases. And my involvement was basically over, but the one thing that I came out of it with was a security clearance. And when the Obama administration later decided to restart the cases in 2012, they were looking for an attorney to lead the defense of Amar Albelucci, and they remembered that I'd been involved, and they reached out to me. Now, at the time, the contract or the arrangement that I had was only for 18 months. Everybody expected the case to be charged by September 11th of 2011. Uh, I'm I'm sorry, I said 2012, but it was actually 2011. By September 11th, 2011, and to be in trial within a year. That turned out not to be true at all. And here it is, 2023, and we're still somewhat in the middle of the case. We're still a long way out from a trial.
Why isn't the principle of speedy trials relevant to the prisoners at Gitmo?
Well, it's relevant, but like a lot of other principles that we as a democracy hold dear, it's mostly ignored down here at Guantanamo.
Mm.
Um, the Every administration including the Biden administration, has taken the position that the Constitution doesn't apply down here at Guantanamo because we are in what the Bush administration originally called the legal equivalent of outer space. And what they meant by that was we're neither fish nor fowl nor good red herring. We're not really anything. There's a very undefined relationship of Guantanamo Bay, which is on a piece of land which is technically on Cuban soil, but has been under 100% American control since 1902. And the Bush administration thought that what that meant was that they could do whatever they wanted down here. Now, that hasn't turned out to be 100% true. They can't do whatever they want, but no court has ever been willing to address the question of, does the Constitution follow the flag? Does the fact that we've had more than 100 years of complete control at Guantanamo mean that the Constitution applies down here? And speedy trial is one of several core principles, like the idea that we don't use information derived from torture, like the idea that people have a right to against self-incrimination, like the idea that Miranda rights apply, that have never made their way down here to Guantanamo Bay because no court has been willing to address that question.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just about the the weird idea, the abstract idea of essentially being in outer space, but it's also the designation of the prisoners originally as enemy combatants. We had a case here in Canada, the Omar Cotter case,
Of
and
course.
the lack of protections for him. He was 15 when
Yeah.
he went there, so the only thing that could, um, you know, uh, not justify but legitimize, I guess, his imprisonment would be those two things: the fact that it's a lawless area, I guess, is what he means by outer space when George Bush said that, and also the designation of enemy combatants. Can we focus on that for a second? Because is that not like the first domino to not being able to have rights as a prisoner inside Gitmo?
Absolutely, it is. And the designation of a person under the Geneva Conventions as to what status they fall into is critically important in determining what protections they get. And the way that it basically works is this: if you are a prisoner of war, that is, that you are associated with the state in some way and you've been captured, then there's a whole panoply of rights that apply under the Geneva Conventions. But if you're not a prisoner of war, if you are some other kind of detainee, and there are other kinds of detainees, then you're protected, still protected under Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, so called Common Article 3, because it's in all four conventions.
Mhm.
And that protects you against torture, it protects you against gross abuse, it protects you against having courts that don't follow the guarantees of civilized society. But what President Bush did with his enemy combatant idea, which the words enemy combatant themselves are contentless, right? They don't mean anything, they don't have a legal effect. But what he thought it meant was that he didn't have to apply either the Geneva Conventions or the sort of catch-all protection for everybody else, because he came up with a very tortured reading of the language, where he said that anyone captured in the war on terror, even if they were fighting on behalf of a state, right, Afghanistan, would be excluded from the Geneva Conventions altogether, even the catch-all that would protect you or me if we were captured in connection with an armed conflict.
Yeah, it had a lot to do with things like uniforms, right? Like if you weren't wearing a military uniform or belonged to a state, right? Like if you weren't fighting on behalf of a nation state and inside a uniform. And it was, and listening to Alberto Gonzalez, like there was a what was the clip where he described the enhanced interrogation techniques as quaint. And
Wow.
these are the same techniques that were used on Ammar. Can you give us a rundown of some of the things that Amar Albelucci has experienced? Not just since he's been in Gitmo, but for wasn't he was captured in 2003, I think, wasn't he?
It was almost exactly 23 years ago on April 29th of 2003. So
Right.
just a little over a week ago was the 20th anniversary of his being held in pretty incredible conditions. So back in 2003, after he was captured and turned over to the CIA, he was subjected to what anyone who actually saw it would call torture. So we're talking about, like, if you just watched a random movie that was about torture, you would probably see these kinds of techniques: being suspended from the ceiling by his hands, being forced to stay awake for days at a time, being put in a tarpaulin of ice water and then submerged under it. So it's the equivalent of taking someone's head and drowning it underwater, except that you tie them down in the tarpaulin and you bring the water up to meet them, submerge them, drown them in the ice water, and then let them down to breathe for a moment, and then bring it back up again. One of the most damaging techniques that was used on Ammar was essentially to take him by the neck, use his neck as a fulcrum, and then bash him against a wall over and over and over. And in your introduction, you mentioned that Ammar was used as a training prop. One of the things that puts the total lie to the idea that this was intended to elicit information is Ammar's case. And the CIA has acknowledged that in Ammar's case, he was used as a training prop, that there were a series of four people who were trying to get certified as interrogators, and they needed their certification. So they just lined up for hours, bashed his head against the wall until not Ammar couldn't take it anymore, until they couldn't take it anymore. And then they would rotate to the next person because they got tired. And that's not something that I came up with. That comes out of the declassified CIA internal review of what they did to Ammar. And that had incredible long lasting effects. As you would expect, a person whose head has been smashed against a wall repeatedly until they lose consciousness what would you expect? A traumatic brain injury. And that's exactly what we find with Ammar, is that he has very severe long-term effects to this day. They're really getting worse, slowly declining over time from that traumatic brain injury.
What has been unearthed as far as what kind of useful information that one can glean from a person when they put them under such duress? We've heard in the past many lawyers such as yourselves, talk about how there really is nothing of value, and eventually they'll tell you anything that you want them to tell you. Has the Department of Defense lawyers, or I don't know who would it be, the CIA, well, it would be the CIA lawyers, I guess, but I guess the American government lawyers who represent the state against Amar Albelucci and others, how do they argue that these techniques are valuable, or do they just say that's classified and we can't get into security answers?
No, what the actual situation is that the two concepts that you mentioned are linked. A person will tell you anything eventually if they that in order to make torture stop, right? The idea that there are these tough guys out there that are going to be able to withstand uh, torture is really the idea of Hollywood. It's not the reality. But that's one of the things that robs any information that you get of value. I mean, what does it matter if you get information from somebody if they've if you want to know, if you say tell me Joe's name and they tell you yes it was Joe, what real intelligence value is to that whatsoever? And so that has created an interesting situation in these military commissions that we have, where the government has abandoned the idea that the actual information obtained by the CIA had any value at all, and that they're not, at this point, they're not even trying to use it in court. What they're trying to do instead is to use information that they got shortly after the torture. They brought in another team of FBI agents to essentially ask the same questions that the CIA had asked, and try to get the same answers to use that in a court. Now, that's become a fascinating, uh, really untold part of this story, because what we've turned up through testimony of many, many FBI agents and a great deal of documentation is how deeply the FBI was involved in the torture program. That they essentially were the information half of this operation. That they would send questions to the CIA, who would relay them out to the torturers, who would extract information or answers at least from people in black sites, and then circulate it again to the intelligence community. And until this case was going on in Guantanamo, that really wasn't known. The FBI had always seemed like sort of the good guys in this situation, but it turns out that their hands were just as dirty as the CIA.
It was Abu Zubaydah, wasn't it, that had that they would use as sort of their poster child for effective torture, essentially. Yeah, go ahead. So
No, no. So Abu Zubaydah was the first person who was brought into the torture program, and it's a complicated story, but it involves both the FBI and the CIA because initially it was a joint FBI CIA operation about Abu Zubaydah. And if you ask the people who were involved, they'll give you very different answers as to the level of force that was used. But one thing is clear is that this is a man near death. Like they thought he was going to die, and they have him chained to a hospital bed, interrogating him, which is not the sort of thing that you would expect to happen ordinarily in a civilized society. And but after, eventually the FBI, one of the FBI agents at least, gets disgusted and leaves, and that's when the CIA goes back to the President Bush, to say, look, this is something that we should have even more power to do, and gets presidential permission to expand this program and use it against other people.
It it's just amazing to me that this first of all happened, but second of all, they must know that it doesn't yield good information. So if we were to just speculate for a second, and I know lawyers don't often like to do that, but like if we could just speculate for a second, what would their motive be, provided the assumption that they kind of also know that it doesn't work? Like, what is it, to scare others from not committing crimes against the United States? Like, what could the motivation possibly be? Or is there an ideology on that side of the military fence that actually still believes that it works?
No, I would say that a significant part of the motivation in that program, part of it came from ignorance, and part of it came from hubris. So the part that came from ignorance is that when the CIA started this program, they knew nothing about interrogating prisoners. I know that seems a little bit odd to us, but since the early 1980s, the CIA had had no involvement whatsoever in interrogating prisoners because they're in the human intelligence business. What the CIA did before 9/11 was they would find people, they would go out, recruit people through whatever means to provide them information, and they would take that human intelligence and they would circulate it to the intelligence community. That was their brief, that was their job. And so they weren't interrogating prisoners. They didn't have any prisoners. And so when this rendition, detention, and interrogation program, which is what the formal name of the torture program, started, is they didn't know what they were doing whatsoever, which is why they turned to outside contractors for advice on, how could we put together a program like this. But the second part is hubris, and I really feel, we kind of, politics have changed so much in the years since the Bush administration. In many ways for the worse, and in some ways for the better. But one thing that we can't forget about the early Bush administration is that, led by Gonzalez and Cheney and others, the Bush administration was a big fan of the imperial presidency. They were a big fan of the idea that the executive is essentially a king and can do whatever they want. And I think that there was a significant motivation behind this to say, listen, if we can establish the power of the presidency to torture people, we can establish any power for them whatsoever, because torture is the outer bound of what any state can do to a person. Torture and genocide are the two outer boundaries of the crimes that a state can commit. And if it's okay for the president to torture people, it's okay for them to do anything. And I think that was a key part of it. They wanted to say the president can do whatever he wants.
Also, reputationally around the world, like this broadcast is from Canada. um America is our neighbors. I love Americans. I go there fairly often, or used to before the pandemic. And the what has it done? Because there's a lot of things that we as regular people don't see. We don't know what happens in the corridors of the United Nations. We know that the United States is a big superpower. We know that people don't really want to mess with them or whatever. But are there um, lasting negative ancillary impacts to the reputation of the United States from a human rights perspective because of this program?
Oh my goodness, there's no question that that's true. I mean, there's so many calls in the world, so many important applications right now for human rights, whether we're talking about the war in Ukraine, whether we're talking about the treatment of the Uyghurs and others in China. There are just so many reasons why it's important to have clean hands on human rights issues, not just for the United States, but for the West in general. And every time the United States brings up against Russia, for example, of, look at the attacks on civilians. Russia can say, well, Guantanamo's open, isn't it? Look what you did.
Yeah. So where are we at then? As far as Amar Albelucci's case, and when, because things happen so slow. I remember when Obama, what was that, 2009? Obama said, "Okay, we're done with the military commissions," and then,
Yeah.
as you pointed out, they came. They just basically restarted, right? Where are you now in that specific case, and what does the timeline look like, or can you even predict something like that? Because I mean, the guy's been there for 20, or he's been captured for 20 years, but he's been in Guantanamo now for 17 years.
Right. So the case there have been two military commissions case, one that you point out that Bush started, but Obama ended, and then Obama's military commission case that they started, that administration started, was almost exactly 11 years ago. So it started on the 5th of May 2012, and I've been involved with it, essentially full time since that time. And the case is really kind of in the middle. We're waiting for the judge to rule on some discovery matters. What does the government have to turn over? There has been a proposal for plea bargaining, and we're waiting to see if that goes anywhere. But the case may return to active litigation this summer, or it might not. It's impossible to know. And I've glossed over an awful lot there. So if you
No,
have
it's okay.
questions about any of the specifics of that, I'm happy to address it.
Well, one thing is the plea bargain, because I know that there was a little bit of controversy. I don't remember how many years ago it was, but where, I guess, in Guantanamo, near the I guess the cells, the military put listening devices, and they had essentially introduced as evidence a so-called confession from al-Baluchi. Can you tell us what that was?
So I think maybe a couple of things there got conflated there. There
Oh,
was an
sorry.
issue where there was listening devices, not so much of the prisoners, but of the lawyers.
Oh,
That led
wow.
to a big issue in the case because we discovered a listening device in the spaces where the attorney and clients met together.
Wow.
That was shortly followed by um, an an event when we were going along in court, and a remote intelligence officer reached in and turned off the court, shut off the feed to the outside world, uh, started a white noise generator, and the judge got very mad because up to that point the judge had thought that he was in control of the court like an ordinary judge,
Yeah.
but that really disabused him of that notion. So those things all happened very close in time. There were a lot of other um, problems that arose from intelligence and law enforcement interference in the case. One of the teams had an analyst on that team recruited as an FBI informant from inside the team.
Mm.
There have been a lot of questioning of team members. One of the reasons why the case takes so long is that the law enforcement and intelligence elements in the case have not gotten out of their own way, don't seem to be able to get out of their own way, and have did a lot to interfere with the case moving forward.
Yeah, there was a what was it? I'm sorry. I'm trying to think back to the notes that I don't have in front of me.
Yeah.
The idea that there was that al-Baluchi had confessed when he was really just sort of discussing his case and the possibility of just ending it by making a plea deal. That was described as a confession, wasn't it?
Oh, I see. Um,
Yeah.
so I can't comment on the means by which the information was acquired,
I'm sorry. Okay.
but there was some information introduced in court about a conversation that Ammar had, you know, eh, where he's discussing possible, what can we do in this case? What can we do to get it over with? What if I
Mm.
pled guilty? And yes, that was at one point characterized as a confession. There are some legitimate plea negotiations that have been going on since March of 2022. There were proposals put forth by both sides to bring it into the case to get some judicial finality to this case that's been going on for, in one form or another for 15 years now. And what we're doing now is waiting to see whether the Biden administration will give us an answer as to whether they think those proposals will hold water or not. It's not even a question of we're waiting to, we're trying to get to yes yet. We're just trying to get any kind of answer of, we've put forward some proposals, and we've worked with the prosecution, and now we're just waiting to hear, what do you all think in the administration? And it's been 14 months since we sent up those proposals, and we still don't have any kind of answers.
And some of the evidence that that has been brought against al-Baluchi is really kind of it just seems flimsy even when you just read it. There was his name was Marwan al-Sheki, and he was like a businessman who did business with like several Americans, but
Sure.
none of those Americans were accused of like offering material support for terrorism. Was al-Baluchi a person? Maybe you can talk a little bit about him more as a
Sure.
person. Let's humanize him for a second, because was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did he have bad friends but wasn't involved? Like, can you give me an idea of his chronology in this case, like, or
Yeah, sure.
before he was captured?
Sure. Ammar was born in Kuwait, and but he wasn't a Kuwaiti. Being born in Kuwait doesn't make you a Kuwaiti. They have a sort of understrata of society, of people who are uh, citizens of other countries, and but he grew up speaking Arabic. In fact, he really grew up as a child thinking that he was Kuwaiti, but then his family moved from there back to his homeland, which is Baluchistan. Now, Baluchistan is the southernmost province of Iran. It's also the westernmost province of Pakistan. It at one point was essentially one big area, but the British divided it up at some point in 1871, actually, like the British divided up so many places
Yeah.
and created so many artificial lines. And Baluchistan is one of those. And eventually, the Iranians brought it under the control of Iran, and it's an unbelievably rural, poverty-stricken area, but it's also unbelievably oppressed within Iranian society, which is already an incredibly oppressive society. But the Baluchi in general are Sunni Muslim instead of Shia Muslim, which places them outside the mainstream of Iranian society. Uh, the the Baluch are ethnically different than the Persians, which places them in a place where they are discriminated against, and essentially they're sort of a colony of Iran where they're really just exploited for their economic resources. So he moves back to Baluchistan, which is a very tough situation, but he makes the best of it. When he shows up in Baluchistan, he doesn't speak Farsi at all, right? Because he had grown up in Kuwait, speaking either Baluchi in the home or speaking Arabic in school. But he buckles down. He learns Farsi. He passes an exam, and he gets into an elite school. He goes to that elite school um, for a while, and then eventually he uh, goes to a different school, graduates, and gets into computers. He gets his Microsoft certification. He's a Microsoft certified software engineer at that time, and he goes to Dubai, where he works at a computer company. And like a lot of people who travel from South and Central Asia to the Gulf to earn money and send it back to their families. Now, one of the ways, of course, that you earn money and send back to your family is by wiring it, and that's true all over the world. Is that I'm sure that in Canada you have a lot of people who move there in search of a better life and send money back to their families wherever they may be,
A
and that
process, I believe, if I may say, was invented in the Middle East, wasn't it?
yeah.
That type of banking, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
yeah,
In the Arab Empire, when they, was very economically advanced a long time ago, and now it all works on with wire transfers and stuff, of course. But
yeah.
and so essentially, what the allegations against him are is that his uncle, and here we come to this important part, his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gives him money and says somebody's going to call you for it, and somebody does call him. He wires the money. Those are that. And some people who transited through Dubai, and he went to the mall with them and stuff, are essentially the allegations against Ammar. And so it's not exactly wrong place, wrong time. It's more like wrong family. And I've often thought that if he were not the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that we not might not find ourselves in this situation.
Yeah, and I kind of hate this term, so I don't mean it literally, but it sounds like he played the role of the quote useful idiot, right? Like he was unbeknownst to him, there was some darkness attached to that money, because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is the person who the mastermind, I guess, or whatever of 9/11. So
And there's
it was
nothing illegal about wiring money. I mean, people
right.
wire billions of dollars every day, and there's nothing illegal about having cash and wiring it someplace else. It's only if it is in service of a some illegal activity that it that it becomes illegal, and sort of that's kind of determined retroactively, right? He didn't know anything more about 9/11 than anybody else did, but retroactively, it all gets pieced together into a conspiracy.
I'm trying to figure out how to word this question because I don't want it to sound either flippant or ignorant. But at what point does the guilt or the innocence of a person almost become not irrelevant but secondary to the extreme torture that they experienced? Like, can they be compartmentalized? If you know what I mean.
One, yeah, absolutely. I will tell you that one of the things that I often express about this case, because what let me tell you that when we have these hearings down there, they are super intense, right? We have five defendants, we have an army of lawyers on both sides, we have victim family members, we have non-government organizations who come to observe. I mean, it is an intense experience down here. And I always try to take account of both of the factors that you just talked about, which is that of the people who show up down here to watch, half of them come to see the trial of people who they blame, or at least they blame some of them, for the death of their loved ones on 9/11. And then we have other people who come to see information about the torture that their or the United States government committed. And both of those things can be important at the same time, right? But by acknowledging the torture of Ammar and other men, you're not diminishing the suffering on 9/11. And by acknowledging the suffering on 9/11, you're not diminishing the fact that the United States committed, heinous international crimes against people in its custody. So, to me, the way that I look at it, James, is not that one makes the other irrelevant. It's that both of those things have to exist in tension with each other at the same time. And it's one of the challenges for me, as an advocate who cares deeply about my client, but also recognizes the suffering of the victims and their family members, to negotiate both of those avenues at the same time.
Yeah, that must be really difficult because like, it must be like a labyrinth of ideas that get all tangled up from one side of the court to the other. Because you know, it must be a natural instinct for those people that are in the gallery to think, well, if that person's guilty, I don't care if he got tortured, right? And if that person is innocent, he shouldn't have been there anyways. Like there seems to be an appetite for that type of violence. And look, I guess it comes from a place of grief or something, right? Like I understand it to a certain degree, but it seems like these cases have gone on for so long. I'm curious actually. Is there any successful? I know that Omar Khadr in Canada sued the Canadian government for denying him. I think it was denying him legal constitutional rights because they
Mhm.
knew what was happening in Guantanamo Bay, and so he sued and we settled.
Settled, yeah.
Yeah. Has there been anything like that for any of the hundreds of inmates that have been in Gitmo and are now gone?
There's only been one case where there was a successful lawsuit in an American court, and that was called Salem versus Mitchell, in which the ACLU led an effort to um, sue some of the people who had been involved in the torture program, and that case ultimately settled. Nobody knows for how much because it was sealed. The key to that, however, was that the Obama administration did not assert its state secrets privilege to shut down the case, whereas most of the other cases against contractors or government officials or other people who are involved in abusive detention and torture have been shut down because of state secrets. Now, in the European courts, there have been some successful cases um, of prisoners here at Guantanamo who have successfully sued people or sued other governments, because in the European system you can sue governments much more successfully than you can in the American system.
And in Canada too,
Yeah,
apparently. Um,
yeah,
how's Amar doing right now?
yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's where I was about to go next. Because there's the torture, there's the historical torture, right? There's what the United States did, there's the historical attacks on 9/11, which are important, and then there's the here and now. And the Amar is a person who has suffered deeply from torture and continues to do so. I mentioned earlier the traumatic brain injury that he has. Um, the you know his actual brain was changed by the way that they abused him, both by the physical abuse of being hit against a wall, but also by the essentially the soaking in stress hormones for years at a time, that essentially decays your brain over time. And there's been some very powerful studies on that about how that works. But what it makes sense that a person who's under unbelievably intense strain for a great period of time. And that continues out of the CIA black sites and into Guantanamo, where they were held in continued to be held in solitary confinement, complete solitary confinement until 2009, and then it was slowly stepped down over time. And so we're talking about, years and years of not speaking to another human being who's not your captor. And there's no way that a person comes out of that in a healthy mental state. And so that's where Amar finds himself. He can't remember things, he can't concentrate, he can't think, he can't sleep, and those issues are not going to go away. And that's sort of the third leg that has to be negotiated in the case, which is that there's the historical torture, there's the historical attacks of 9/11, but then there's also the continuing effect that the torture has on Amar as he tries to deal with unbelievably complex legal issues.
When was the last time he was actually interrogated?
The last time he was actually interrogated was January 30th of 2007.
Wow, 16 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to characterize how I think I might feel. I mean, he's been there for more than half his life, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Does he? How are his spirits as far as his confidence in the system? I almost laugh at myself saying that, but I mean,
Yeah.
like part of your job as a lawyer, right, is to try to is to recognize your client obviously has been through hell and back, but also to be like, listen, we gotta try to have some hope. Like, is there any hope in this man left? Like, how could there be? You know?
Well, yeah, confidence in the system is not a
Yeah.
phrase that can, accurately be used for anybody here at Guantanamo. I mean,
Mm.
wh- w- there are people here at Guantanamo who've been here for 20 years and never even seen the inside of a courtroom. And so, in one sense, there is some advantage to having a judge who will listen to some things, to have lawyers who are funded to work on your behalf. So there is that's not confidence in the system, but it is closer to due process than some of the situation that many of the men have had, where there are 16 men here at Guantanamo who have never been charged with anything, will never be charged with anything, and have been cleared for release by an administrative body consisting of all the U.S. intelligence agencies, and they're still here at Guantanamo. And then there are three more forever prisoners who are not authorized to be released ever, have never been authorized, have not been cleared, and have never been charged with anything, which means that they've never had any chance to defend themselves in a court. Muhammad Rahim, who is my other client, falls into that category of a person who has just been drifting in the prison cells of Guantanamo for more than a decade and a half.
So how? Okay, maybe I'll ask it like this: how come the Hague have never tried to? Is it just because America's the superpower? Like, I can't imagine many countries getting away with doing this unless they're the United States.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the United States, after supporting creation of the International Criminal Court withdrew its support for the International Criminal Court. But then it went around and signed bilateral agreements with essentially every country in the world not to extradite any American to The Hague. So essentially, the United States has negotiated immunity for itself from prosecution for war and international human rights crimes.
And so, just to circle back to that previous question about the reputation internationally, uh, they built a firewall around themselves, like the United States as a country, as far as accountability goes in these cases? Then have they successfully built that firewall?
Yeah, absolutely. If charges were brought against a U.S. government official or even non-governmental official, just somebody, a contractor or somebody else who were involved, no country could legally extradite them to The Hague to face charges there. But I will tell you this, that there was a bright spot this year in January that we had not seen before, which is that a United Nations Special Rapporteur was able to visit Guantanamo. She wasn't able to see Ammar. She wasn't able to see Rahim. She wasn't able to see many of the prisoners there, but she was able to go to Guantanamo, which is the first time that that's ever happened. And she was able to um, interview an awful lot of people, some prisoners, but a lot of officials down there. And we're expecting a report from her essentially any day now. With her findings on what she discovered when she was there at Guantanamo, so that's the first time that the United Nations official has been allowed on Guantanamo, and so that is a tiny step forward in the constant quest for accountability.
I'm curious because your job must be really stressful. How are you handling all this?
Well, that's kind of you to ask. Um, it's been a long time, and I basically everybody in the world suffered a lot during COVID, and that was true for me personally. But it was really nothing compared to the men down here. I
Mhm.
had family with me and it was in my house, and but the isolation that they endured down here. The lawyers who would ordinarily come, the staff who ordinarily come down here, no one was able to travel for close to a year, and for 15 months nobody was able to travel to Guantanamo, and so that meant that they were completely isolated down here, and that was a really really dark period for them. I would say that as much as anything else, that was a throwback to the severe isolation of the black sites and the early days of Guantanamo.
Are you worried that the room you're in may have listening devices?
I count on it.
Do you really?
Plus, I am talking on a public, live stream. So anybody who wants to listen to what I have to say right now is certainly welcome to.
Yeah. Well, listen. I think what you do, I think the work that you do is massively important. It's a weird spot to even talk, like from my perspective, or to even criticize what's happening there, because the United States are neighbors, and I don't view the United States as like this evil entity or anything, but um, when it comes to the military and when it comes to Gitmo and CIA black sites and that kind of stuff, it is such a black mark on human rights for a nation like the United States, and it feels like there is just no way to hold the United States accountable for this. So men like you and people like you, because I know Alka is such a juggernaut when it comes to this stuff as well. That we, I guess, collectively, the people that care about this issue and these issues rely on people like yourselves to sort of chip away, I guess, at the at that firewall. How confident are you that in 20 years, maybe there'll be some hindsight wisdom on behalf of the government, even if it happens secretly behind closed doors? Like, are you confident that that may happen eventually one day?
No, I'm not at all confident of that. I mean, here we are 20 years after a Mars capture, and there's been no wisdom, there's been no insight that the United States government seems to have acquired. Um, if the case returns to litigation, as it could, this case could go on for another 20 years. That's entirely within the possibility. I don't think anybody wants it, including Amar and the others, but the administration may not does is making some progress in getting people out of Guantanamo, but there's no plan to close it that I know anything about. And and we normally just labor away here in darkness where nobody really knows what we're doing. There are a couple of ways to keep up with what we're doing. There are two Twitter feeds that cover us pretty well. The Gitmo Watch Twitter feed covers us well, and Carol Rosenberg of the
Okay,
New
yeah.
York Times covers us well. There's a third one, Law Dragon. Is a smaller publication that does a great job. Often sends its reporter down here, and but otherwise, like it's so hard to get here that most of the reporters don't bother coming, and nobody knows what's happening down here. Even when we do make strides in moving forward on accountability, like the information we've been able to bring out about the FBI, it's just
Hmm.
hard for people to get that information.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm proud of you. I think that the work that you're doing is really important. I know it must be super frustrating, but to know that Ammar has an ally is a very, very, very small nugget of hope that people that follow these cases can hold on to. And please wish him my best. I know he doesn't know me, but I mean, maybe it's nice to have a stranger tell him that I hope he's doing well once in a while, because the guy's been where he is for so long. And I would love to have you back, or members of your firm back. I was telling Alka in an email that I think I would like to do 2 shows a month that sort of like navigate around these issues. So whether it's a Mars case or correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't your firm also represent people whose families were impacted or killed by drone strikes and things like that as well?
No, that's not me. It's very much in
Okay.
our space, and Alka's done a lot of work on that issue. But my issues are mostly Guantanamo, and then open government issues like freedom of information, and then interestingly, music law
Really?
is my side gig. Just to, have a little palate cleanser from time to time.
What? So you like hook artists up with deals with distributors and things like that? Like what is
Yeah.
your
I mean, or help them. What I've found is that music just turns out to be another area in which poor people get exploited, and minorities get taken advantage of. And so, I help people with their licensing and their working through their copyright issues and other things, because it turns out that people are just trying to take their money and their talent and not reward them properly. So,
That sounds
uh,
like hip hop. Do you have hip hop clients?
yes.
I interview famous rappers on this show. Maybe we can talk about interviewing a couple of those guys because I don't know.
That sounds
Are you
fun.
allowed
And
to
if
tell me who you represent? Is that okay?
no, I don't have their permission to tell you.
Okay. Well, then I'll bug you in an email.
Sounds good. Well, listen, James, thanks so much for having me on this show,
Yeah.
and
Thank
I
you.
appreciate the work you're doing and bringing some light to these issues. And I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Okay. Thanks, James. James Connell, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was really interesting. I don't think I've ever done an interview like that. Not just the fact that he was at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is crazy in and of itself. And he mentioned that he's not sure if any podcasts have been done there. I'm happy to be the first because I think these issues are massively important. The idea that a person can spend 20 years in a cage without having really any recourse, without having any rights, was tortured for years before he even got there, and the world just forget about him. It's a very sad case, and he's not the only one by any means. It's also something that I find really sinister. The oftentimes I feel like the American government will violate human rights and then never wants to admit it, and so we'll spend years violating more human rights just as a way to cover up the fact that they were doing it to begin with. And I find it I find it really disheartening. My big thanks again to James. I think it's Connell. I think I should pronounce it. I said Connell like I was some sort of like I don't know British guy or something. I just got an email from Eric Alper. Eric Alper, if you guys remember, is the music guru. And so Pat Carey from Downchild is going to be on Blackballed on Friday. And then that's at 7 o'clock. And then a famous songwriter, Mark Jordan, will be on at 7:30. So this apparently those are really big musicians. And I haven't really educated myself as much as I should have, but I will do the deep dive as I always do. Tomorrow, Canadian rapper and I would say one of our greatest entrepreneurs that we have in this country in the hip hop space. Peter Jackson is going to be here. Peter Jackson also, we had a mutual friend named Sheldon Moore, aka S Love of the Pox Brothers, who passed away tragically last year of cancer. And that's kind of how we connected through our mutual admiration of what we would call a super producer, a behind the scenes hip hop magician, Sheldon, who passed away last year. So we're gonna have a lot to talk about. He's also doing big things. I think he has a tour coming up, and he has a company. I'm sorry, I forget the name of it right now. We'll cover all this tomorrow. But who brings up like big acts from golden era and current rap guys as well that will tour the country, and he owns the touring company. So he's like a legit businessman, and he's a dope ass rapper as well. So that should be fun. And to be perfectly honest with you, I am completely on the fence of whether or not I'm going to do a Casual Friday this week. My internet is not acting up. I feel like Elon Musk is just going to be like, oh, that guy, let's ruin his podcast. That's my Elon Musk impersonation. It's not very good, but, you know, I try. But again, Peter Jackson tomorrow, and those two artists whose names I already forgot. Pat Carey from Downchild and Mark Jordan on Friday. And thank you again to James Connell and to everyone who's watching, and we'll see you next time on Blackballed.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed.